This episode of Time Out with Tinseltown Mom is brought to you by our Back to School Student Planner, which is designed to help students plan their days in a more effective way. It's an instant downloadable 10-page planner that comes in 5 colors, and students can plan their days, weeks, months, and academic school year. They can also track their grades, homework, exercise, and reading. Go to etsy.com/shop/Tinseltown Mom Shop and get yours for $5. Again, that's etsy.com/shop/Tinseltown Mom Shop and get your student planner today. I'll also leave the link in the show notes. Hi everyone, I'm Tara-Lon. Welcome to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. On today's episode, we'll be speaking with Dr. Sanam Hafeez, a licensed psychologist who's on the faculty at Columbia University's PhD program in clinical psychology. She's also a sought-after television, media, and print personality, often appearing on The Dr. Oz Show, CNN, CBS, NBC, Fox, and WPIX, as well as contributing to well-regarded newspapers, journals, and magazines. Today, we're going to discuss increased cases of mental illness in kids, specifically anxiety and depression, and how to help them cope during this pandemic. Hi, Dr. Hafeez. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I feel like this topic is one that a lot of people are talking about.
Absolutely. And I think it's getting a lot more attention now. Parents are always looking, and what concerned about their children. And I think generally parents are I'm a parent, so I can attest to this. We're pretty preoccupied with our children's health in general. But what I'm hearing a lot about is because of this quarantine, because of this lockdown, parents have had to spend so much more time with their children at home, and they're watching things evolve and unfold that they might have either missed or just not seen enough of. And I think it's really beginning to cause a lot of parents to question a lot of things that they, never really saw coming.
Right. Now, in your own experience, are you seeing a surge in cases of kids who are experiencing anxiety and depression specifically? Like, can you kind of measure that since COVID started?
Here's the thing. It's hard to say only because we were closed down as a practice, in the brick and mortar sense for about 3 months. But I can tell you that since we've gone back, we're generally a pretty busy center as it is. But since we've gone back, the number of inquiries and consults and people asking to come in is really, it's surprising because we can't keep up. We're trying to stay at this 50-75% capacity. So we're grateful, but, we're getting all kinds of cases, but because we see children and adults. But what I'm seeing a lot of are parents saying exactly what I just, finished saying to you, that, during this pandemic, we watched our child have greater anxiety because they didn't really know how to sort of catch on with the remote learning or being in online classes. Or I was just seeing more tantrums, or my child was sending homework without actually completing it and lying about it. There's just so much around this. And so I think there are 2 aspects to this. There is the aspect of the problems are always there. They've been exacerbated, because of the pandemic, and the parents are actually getting to witness it. And then there's the other aspect of the pandemic causing or triggering an anxiety-ridden or a depressive response.
Right. I think that's key what you said. There's actually parents, actually witnessing this happening because, they're in school all day, the kids, so they may not even understand like what happens between the child and the teacher dynamic. Like some of this mental illness like type issues could have been happening, but because the parents aren't there on a regular basis, they don't really see it. But now that they're seeing their kids all day, it could be shedding more light on the issue that may be there or may not be there. So, so just for parents who may be unsure of what's going on with their child, can you just kind of explain what anxiety is in kids, like what that looks like, and also depression? I mean, you can start with the anxiety just to kind of give us a overview of what that might look like for a child.
Yeah. So anxiety, in children and in adults, is sort of hard to ignore because, when someone is depressed, let's say, you can't tell necessarily by looking at them unless they're crying or they always seem sad and, it's really overt. With anxiety, the reason people can pick up on it and it's hard to ignore because it carries a lot of physical symptomatology with it. In children and in adults, you can have, a sort of a flushing or an excessive blushing of the face. You can have sweaty palms. You can have a rapid heartbeat. You can see the distress all over someone who's anxious, like eyes darting, not being able to focus. With children, we get a lot of referrals that look like ADHD, or they're referred for ADHD, and it turns out it's not. It's really anxiety that almost mimics ADHD. So anxiety can take so many different forms. People are surprised to find that anxiety it's a tremendously big umbrella, right? Mm-hmm. So anxiety can look like a panic attack, like a full-blown panic disorder or panic attack. It can just be a general worrying, just someone who is always a child or a person who is always excessively worrying, but also people who have catastrophic thinking, where they think something awful is going to happen. Obsessive compulsive disorder, where children develop a need to do something a particular way, or obsessively or repetitively. There's also, anxiety with like PTSD. Not everyone responds to trauma the same way. So PTSD, or that hypervigilance response, is anxiety. A lot of people don't know this, but hoarding is anxiety, right? Nail biting is anxiety. Mm-hmm. Social anxiety, not being able to be around other people and avoiding social situations, and anxiety. So anxiety is really far more prevalent than most people give it credit for. And, to some degree, it's okay for some of us to have anxiety, because it kind of puts things in motion. It kind of starts this process of maybe motivating us. So I say, whenever I lecture about anxiety, I say, anxiety is not the worst thing in the world, as long as it's manageable and you can channel it productively. It's only when it becomes excessive and the demands of whatever's stressing you out is so great that it taxes, your mental health, your physical health, your financial resources. That's when anxiety becomes a clinical diagnosis.
Okay. And you said something important, that a lot of people misdiagnose anxiety for ADHD. Now, how might anxiety mimic ADHD? Like, let's say there's a hyperactive child who just can't sit still. Like, how could those symptoms, I guess, of ADHD or anxiety, like, how could they kind of be interchangeable? Like, if a parent is kind of confused on what their child may be experiencing.
I mean, I think anyone listening to this podcast, you and I ourselves, I don't think there's anyone who can't relate to, let's say, going into work or going to school, having had, something distressing or stressful on our minds. It's near to impossible to focus. So something very simple, you're putting the wrong numbers down. You are, pouring tea into your water bottle. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're just distracted, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's us as adults, and when you have a child who, let's say, is anxious about, let's say they have performance anxiety. They're anxious about a test. They show up. The teacher looks over and sees this kid with eyes darting around, looking out the window, not being able to focus, sort of like just moving, being restless, asking to go to the bathroom. The easier way to, sort of interpret that is to think, well, I guess this child just can't focus. He's inattentive, or she's restless and, looking for excuses to go get a drink of water or go to the bathroom. It's only the child who can tell you, and not, children are not the most forthcoming, they have a hard time understanding their own emotions. So we often find that if it's not comorbid, meaning occurring at the same time, sometimes anxiety is mistaken for ADHD.
That's interesting. Okay, so a lot of kids, I guess when they're younger, they're probably misdiagnosed. Like, when could you actually know for sure what that diagnosis might be? Like, how could a parent discern if their child actually has anxiety? Like, maybe it's not the child not listening to the teacher, but maybe, like you mentioned, they're deep in thought about something they're worrying about. Like, how do you kind of, I guess, as a doctor, how do you like pull that out? Like, is that something that someone has to be treated for specifically, like to find out or uncover if that's actually something that they should be diagnosed with? I don't know if I explained that fully.
Yeah, look, I mean, in my line of business, I'm a neuropsychologist, which makes me primarily assessment based. My job is to uncover this stuff. So when a patient comes in, a parent brings a child in, I find that usually they will do that when there's enough mounting evidence and they're concerned. And so for us, it's not difficult at all, because what I'm designed, my practice, my our operations are designed to assess anxiety and ADHD and depression and learning disabilities and autism. We have the tools that allow us to do that. But for parents who might be listening in, really, children are, if they're forthcoming or candid with anyone, it's their parents, right? Because they can let their guard down. So if you find that your child at night is excessively scared of the dark, is bedwetting past the age of 5 or 6, asks several times, where are we going tomorrow? When are we going to leave? Who's coming over? And it's not typical, right? Most children really can't be bothered with details like that. So when you've got a child who, sort of asks questions repetitively and seeks affirmation or seeks some sort of reassurance constantly, that's a pretty good sign that there might be some anxiety going on. Also, if you have a child who has nightmares, who consistently, seems to avoid new experiences, is scared of the unknown. As a parent, when something doesn't sound right, even if, especially if you have more than one child, I think it might be a little easier, because you're like, oh, the other one doesn't act like this. But, I think anxiety is not that difficult to pick up on. Even for a child who, children change their behaviors very often, but parents will often tell me that, this child of mine, even when he or she was a baby, I just saw that they were harder to soothe as a baby, or they had a lot of separation anxiety, more so than my other children, or, just sort of was very easily startled or scared. So anxiety, if you have it, it's always present in some form. It's just a matter of when it starts to interfere with daily functioning.
Okay. Now, I know with ADHD, there's medication to treat that. Do you treat anxiety do you use medication for anxiety treatment?
Yeah, when it comes to very young children, especially, I'm very conservative when it comes to recommending medication for both anxiety and ADHD. But there are times when, in all those cases, you have to kind of weigh the cost of medication against the cost of the continued harm, right?
Right.
So, anxiety can cause so much inflammation and chronic stress that's not good for people's health. And children, so the only cases I can tell you where just for anxiety, I really sort of say, look, I would love to tell you that we can just fix this with cognitive behavioral therapy. And, let's say we've given it a fair shot and we still find that it's not working. And I'll recommend medication is for children who are selectively mute. I don't know if you know what selective mutism is, but a very quick, short description of it are children who refuse to talk outside the home, just absolutely refuse to talk. And that's an anxiety disorder. I mean, I didn't even think of this the first time. There's just so many anxiety disorders.
Yeah.
So, I've had cases where it's just become painful at this point. The child goes to school, is now failing, even though they're often very smart, and just won't speak. And then I've got, cases where a child won't stop bedwetting or has gastric issues. GI issues often go hand in hand with anxiety, a very similar pathway. And so children who often complain of stomach aches are not making them up. They have there's a connection between the gut and anxiety. So there are some cases where the greater good is served by putting a child on medication for anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what about depression? Can you just kind of give a general overview of what that might look like in a child? Because I know it's not the same as for adults. Like, what are some signs that parents should look out for?
I mean, the general signs for depression, are kind of consistent. A child who maybe cries easily, a child who is easily hurt and upset about, something that otherwise other children may not take very seriously, a child who just sort of sees the worst or sort of the negative in everything. Anxiety and depression overlap a lot. So a lot of things, depression might look like anxiety. A child who complains a lot of physical ailments, depression, and often will tell you. I mean, I've got parents who just, will actually say, to be honest with you, my child has never truly been able to enjoy things. It's just sort of depressed. We'll say, hey, guess what? We're going to go to the park, or let's go get ice cream. And while most kids will be like excited and go, yay, a depressed child will just have a hard time finding that excitement or that passion. Some signs to look out for, especially as children get older, is again similar to what the adults might experience: difficulty getting out of bed, eating too much or eating too little, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, losing interest in activities that, if your child loved to, run around, go to the park, build things, draw, talk to their friends, watch TV, and you're just watching them withdraw, that's usually a pretty big sign.
Okay. Now, in your professional opinion, Dr. Hafeez, can kids actually grow out of a mental disorder? Let's say it is ADHD. Like, is that something when they get older they can kind of overcome, or will it be with them forever?
That's a tricky question because, mental health, like many other issues, can sort of come and go in waves. So let's say if you have a child who's anxious, there's a chance they're probably going to be somewhat anxious or a little bit on the risk averse, nervous side always, but if you catch it early and you teach them the tricks and sort of techniques and strategies to get around it, they're so much better off than adults who find out what they have as adults, right? Because as children, we're just so much more pliable. Now, technically, research says that only 25% or something of children who have ADHD go on to have it as adults. And that's also not the truth. The brain does change and it does, grow and sort of mature over time. What I think happens is that children with ADHD learn to cope either because they've had help or because just school of hard knocks, So if you show up to class late enough times, you might fail it, you might get kicked out. And it may not be as, consequential, but when you grow up as an adult and you show up to work late 3 times, there's a good chance you're going to get fired for it. And that happens enough times, people pull it together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean they stop struggling. It just means they find ways to get around it. So I don't think that's necessarily a very good estimate. Adults who function really well but had ADHD as children will say things like, I can't sit in traffic. I just can't. I will zigzag my way out of it. They're more likely to have motor vehicle accidents. Or you find that on the surface, they may not seem like they have ADHD, but you dig a little deeper. They've changed jobs way too many times. They've changed their majors too many times. They start things, they never finish it. Their room looks like a mess. They're still managing, right? But who's going to say they have ADHD? Because who's picking up on that?
Right.
That only happens when you're young and you're in a classroom and your parents and your teachers are on you. But if you're showing up to work and you're getting it done, no one's going to tell you, hey, maybe you should go get some help.
Yeah. I mean, that's a little motivational, I think, for some parents. Like if they're looking at long term, like what their child's future might look like with ADHD or even another mental illness. Now, because kids are home more, of course, they're on technology more. I know my kids are on technology more. Do you think there's a connection with mental illness and technology? Like, do you think that makes the mental illness worse by them being on these devices for these hours on end?
Yes and no. Look, I don't think technology can cause a mental illness or, ADHD, even though there's a little bit of, there's some research that kind of with ADHD points to this, what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think every listener right now can probably relate to the fact that we are so distracted, even as adults, by our cell phones and something that's constantly pinging or an email that just needs to be checked, or even Instagram, in case we miss some update from someone we've never spoken to, mm-hmm. right? Like we all have this. So I think it's silly to say that screens don't play a role in it. They absolutely exacerbate anyone's executive functioning or attention or just an ability to complete tasks. We open 10 things on our computer and are somehow distracted and go, oh, wow, I was working on this. I completely forgot. Now put that in an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old's brain. I mean, it's a lot to carry. So I think screens do play a role. We found that people who spent more time on social media, for instance, including children, had much greater rates of anxiety and depression. We don't always know the causal effect. It's not always a clear relationship. We can just say, hey, if you spend more time doing this, this goes up. We're not sure that what if you're spending more time doing that because you already are anxious and depressed, right? So it's a little hard to make that relationship. But I think anyone would agree that, going out for a walk in nature or just going to the park or just sitting on your stoop having ice cream is sort of a rush of dopamine to your brain. It feels good. It makes you feel alive. It makes you feel happy. You just feel refreshed, as opposed to feeling guilty and really sort of like terrible after you realize I've just wasted an hour just scrolling on, a site, or, just sort of going from one page to another.
Right. Right. Now, I do want to bring up one more mental illness to you, because I had a parent who I spoke to. They had a child who was diagnosed with ADHD, but as they got older, realized that their child actually had bipolar disorder. Now, because I feel like bipolar disorder mimics a lot of what you mentioned earlier, the anxiety, depression. Like, how do you diagnose that in a child?
So, there is bipolar disorder. Then we have something called mood disorder. And then there's a newer category for children that I like, better than just, a big label like bipolar. And it's called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. And what they all mean is, and I'm glad you brought this up, because it's one of my sort of key topics that I cover in my practice and in teaching. What bipolar disorder, mood disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, what they cover is a rapid shift in moods, or too many moods happening at the same time in very rapid fluctuations. And that is very different than just depression, because the physical chemical reaction is different, the symptoms are different, and the outcomes are often different. Usually when a child is, misdiagnosed with depression and put on depression medication and it actually doesn't work, that's usually a sign that maybe you're missing something. Sometimes when children get put on ADHD medication, which are often stimulants, you actually see a worsening of some behaviors when it's misdiagnosed. So a child who was sort of, overly active and, had tantrums can become aggressive and violent, and even sort of depressed, turned inwards. And that's usually when a child with bipolar disorder was misdiagnosed and put on a stimulant. That stimulant is supposed to raise your levels of attention. What they end up doing are raising the levels of the moods, shifting very, very quickly. So it can actually be quite dangerous, when doctors can be somewhat flippant about talking to a parent or seeing a note from a teacher and going, oh yeah, that sounds like ADHD. I mean, it really is something to be taken seriously. And this is why, my whole career has been about pushing for assessments, good psychological standardized assessments.
Okay. So when you do your assessments, you're able to determine specifically what illness that child might have. Like
Yes.
That's what that determines.
Yes, it's a very, very extensive process. It is the closest thing in mental health to something like blood work. And it really gives you some very clear answers about a child's cognitive, academic functioning, neurological functioning. We use standardized tests. So it's not like, hey, one Dr. A says, I think I see anxiety, and Dr. B says, I see ADHD. You are relying on, their expertise and the clinical data to support their expertise. And so you have real answers as opposed to speculations or good educated guesses.
Okay. Now, are there any other treatments besides medication that you recommend? Gosh, it's slipping my mind right now, but I've heard of a treatment where a child's brain is stimulated. They're put under, gosh, I cannot think of it. I'm so sorry. It's cognitive something. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's cognitive.
There are a couple of things.
Okay.
There are a couple of things. So I think cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most researched and the most empirically proven way of changing behavior long term. But what it does, it requires a lot of work on both the therapist, the child, and the parent's part, because it requires compliance. And if you can commit to a treatment under cognitive behavioral therapy, it can not only help you fix the problem now, but it causes long-term gains and changes that can benefit you, 20 years from now. I think there's some other things that might have come your way. And one of them, of course, medicine has always been around. It's always given children, the sort of stimulant that they needed to sort of be able to pay attention. The problem is, A, it's medication. Parents are usually not thrilled about that. B, it works as long as you're physically on the medication, right? And then there's side effects, right? So one of the things that you might have heard of is something called TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Yeah.
Is that the one you were talking about?
Well, I think it's something where the doctor actually, they're looking at some waves or graphs and monitoring the child.
Biofeedback. I think
There you go. Yes, thank you. Biofeedback.
Yeah.
Yes.
So biofeedback has, mixed reviews. There are enough people who've been doing it. I remember doing research in biofeedback back when I was in college. So, I mean, the data is there for a lot of things, right? But if this was it's electrical sensors to different parts of your brain to kind of, manage. But the thing is, by just doing that therapy, it can basically teach children to control impulses and attention and so on and so forth. But what do you do when they're in class and they're not hooked up to all the same electrical sensors, right? Then there's this transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is also non-invasive. And it's basically using magnetic impulses to stimulate neural pathways to help you cope with anxiety, with inattention better. So it's, there are new things now. One of the most interesting things that's recently happened is that the FDA just approved a video game that purports to treat ADHD, which is also really funny because, since I've been in practice, which is a very long time, the one thing that I've heard time and time again, does not fail, is parents saying, I don't understand. How can my son focus so well in video games, but not at school?
Right.
So I think a company said, or maybe a kid who grew up with ADHD said, hey, how about I harness the power of a video game being able to get your attention and make you focus. And interestingly enough, there's this is one big study. It was a big study. They did find ADHD went down after a month of playing this video game for half an hour, 5 days a week, for 4 weeks. It did improve. It did improve the scores. We just don't know enough about it. We don't know how it's going to translate to the school setting. But here's what I've said. I was reached out by the media and they wanted me to comment. And I said, look, it may not work. It sounds ridiculous because we've spent our careers telling parents, try to get your kids off the screen. But if it's teaching children how to focus long enough to perform certain tasks, the worst thing is that after a month, you've got a kid who's been on an iPad or a computer with your permission rather than what they were going to be doing anyway. There isn't that much harm to it, and you might as well give it a shot.
Okay, so where do parents get information on this if they're interested in trying it?
Look, I don't work for this company.
Okay. I see. Okay.
I think it's called, no, I can tell you, I think it's called Endeavor, an endeavor, like something you work toward, an effort. And they can look it up online. FDA just recently approved it, and your doctor, I think, has to prescribe it.
Oh, interesting.
For them to be able to get it. But, again, I think it's interesting, and I think it's novel that we have other approaches, because for those of us who have children, I've got twin boys who are 5. Look, I'm not, even though this is what I do for a living, I wouldn't want to jump on medication, unless it was really warranted. So I understand when parents are not thrilled about putting their kids on medication.
Right. Now, are there any other hope for parents, like just to help their kids, just in general, to be healthy mentally? I know that's a very broad question. I know you mentioned walks earlier, which I try to do with my boys as well frequently.
Yeah, look, I think the more natural, the more candid, the more open and receptive your relationship is. And, it's easier said than done. We all know the challenges of parenthood. I think generally speaking, parents, are usually doing their best, but also understand we're also human beings. We come with our own challenges, our own upbringing, our own work stressors. And, you don't always have time to listen to your kid when you've got to put food on the table for the other, 4 people in your family. Mm-hmm. So I think there are challenges. And I think what I always advise parents is don't be afraid to seek help. There's parent training, there's therapy, there's, all kinds of information and help out there for parents. And parents just don't often recognize that. We don't have the time to sit there and read a parenting book or a self-improvement book. But if you feel like you're always struggling, and it honestly, when parents figure out a way to do that better, it actually helps their life. And if you're teaching a child how to, let's say, meditate every day or take a 10-minute timeout, you're basically doing it for yourself, and your child is watching and saying, oh, not a bad idea. And you're automatically teaching them to be healthy. If you, for instance, I'll give you a quick personal example. I've got a to-do board on my refrigerator, and my boys are only 5, and I tell them every day as I'm writing stuff, I go, look, guys, I finished this, so I'm going to take it off and I'm going to write something else down, because honestly, mama has a lot to do and I don't want to forget it. So it's okay to put things down on paper or on a board. So I'm hoping to teach them some executive skills, because let's face it, life is all about organizing and prioritizing. And we would miss so many things if we didn't have some system in place, right? So, children learn by example. If you start to heal your own life, your children will not only learn then, but also when they grow up to be adults, they'll have more tools than a lot of us had growing up.
That is so well said. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
On that note, thank you so much for being here today. This was very informative. Dr. Hafeez, where can people find you if they want to know more information about you and just the services that you provide?
Absolutely. I'm so always happy to help. My website is www.comprehendthemind.com. One word, Comprehend the Mind. And they can find me on Facebook under my name. And they can find me on Instagram under my handle, Dr. Sanam Hafeez. One word.
Thanks for listening to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. If you liked what you heard today, please be so kind and rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time.